Welcome to a Zeteo breaking news town hall. We're live to discuss probably the biggest story in the world right now. Huge story. We are being told that there has been a ceasefire agreed in Gaza and a hostage deal signed off on by both Israel and Hamas. We've been waiting, many of us, for over a year for this to happen. The Qataris have said it's official. It's happening on Sunday, January the 19th. The Israelis and Hamas have said it's official, although the Israeli cabinet still hasn't voted on it. There's a lot to discuss. What does this deal involve? What does it mean? Where did it come from? Who gets credit for it? Will it stick? And we're going to take your questions. I believe that I'm going to look down now. We've already got 300 people joined in the last 1 minute. So this has been a very in-demand town hall. Apologies if some of your friends didn't get in, but a lot of people want to talk about the biggest story in the world. We've got two great analysts to talk us through it and give us their reactions. I've got Palestinian journalist Muhammad Shehada, who's in Copenhagen, and Israeli journalist Noga Tarnopolsky, who's in Jerusalem. Thank you both for staying up late. It's only 5 o'clock here in DC, but late where you guys are. We're just going to jump right in because there's so much to discuss. First question to you, Muhammad. What was your reaction when you heard the news as a Palestinian? What was your reaction to hear that maybe, just maybe, the bombs are going to stop falling on Gaza?
Well, I had a moment of great relief. I would say a lot of mixed emotions, but the first one is feeling a huge mountain being lifted off my chest. At the same time, there's enormous concern left of whether or not that ceasefire will hold, if there will be a phase two, or if it will be just a temporary pause for 42 days and then back to war again. All indications we're getting from Netanyahu and his government is that they would very much be desperate to resume the war again if there's no external pressure from the US. And the third feeling was basically just realizing now that the music is off, now that all the bombs are off, you have all the time in the world to process what it really means the last 15 months, especially when I try to enjoy the moment with friends and family. And then I'm going through the contact list on my phone, name by name, and trying to call people in Gaza to celebrate with. And it hits you very slowly, incrementally, that most of your loved ones are either killed, missing, or unreachable, that your world is just becoming much more lonelier and colder. So there's also the other sort of very enormous worry that if the ceasefire holds, Gaza is no more. Gaza is going to be uninhabitable, and the Israeli government will make sure of it. The last war around in 2014, the reconstruction process was never completed by the start of this war. It was only 90% completed because Israel restricted reconstruction material from going into Gaza. Now the destruction is a thousandfold what it was back then.
So just some housekeeping for folks joining. We've got several hundred people in the chat. Thank you for joining us for this Zeteo Town Hall. I'm having some issues with my camera. You may see me disappear in and out, but you'll hear me. I'm going to always be running my mouth. And we've got questions in the Q&A. If you've got questions, stick them in the Q&A. Obviously, there's several hundred of you. I'm not going to get through all of them, but I'm going to try and put some of your questions to Muhammad and Noga. I've got some of my own. I mean, Noga, I'm old enough to remember October 2023. Some of us called for a ceasefire right at the start. We were told to be quiet. The mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, was accused of being an anti-Semite because he was the first elected official to come out and call for a ceasefire. Do you remember when Justin Trudeau started saying the word seize and then stopped himself and said pause? We weren't even allowed to say the word ceasefire for a while. Then we had endless negotiations over the course of 2024. We are here now. The Israelis, Netanyahu, your government has signed up to it, we believe. What was your reaction to this news? Did you see this coming?
Yeah, this has been on the works for a while. My reaction was almost indistinguishable from that of Muhammad, I have to say. Relief, caution, fear, lack of processing. I could almost just sign off on what he said. I don't actually remember, I have to tell you, all of those people you're quoting from October 2023, because I didn't have the time at that time to listen to those things, and the situation.
My wider point was a ceasefire was a taboo word, and now today we hope the world will celebrate if this is a real ceasefire. That is what everyone seems to want, except for maybe Itamar Ben-Gvir and a few House Republicans.
Let me underscore. Well, I think there's more than Itamar Ben-Gvir, but it doesn't matter. I do want to underscore maybe the least happy of what Muhammad said that I share. I have a tremendous fear that this may end up being a truncated ceasefire, that it won't, ripen and develop. There are so many things. There are a number of things that could still go wrong by Sunday when it's supposed to enter implementation, but there are infinite number of things many that I have in mind and many that I don't yet have in mind that could go wrong in the 42 subsequent days. And I'm very, very fearful of that we're going to end up with something similar to what we had at the end of November, the last week of November 2023, which is, like that feeling of almost there.
And you mentioned 42 days. This is a 3-phase ceasefire deal. Phase 1 is 42 days, where Hamas releases 33 hostages. Israel releases 30 Palestinian prisoners for each civilian hostage, 50 for each female soldier. There's a halt to the fighting. Israeli forces supposedly move out of populated areas. Displaced Palestinians return home. Then there's a phase 2, which is the harder bit, 42 days of sustainable calm, more hostages released, more of a withdrawal, and then a phase 3 where we're told there'll be a reconstruction plan. Mohammed, you
didn't mention something. You did mention something
Please.
that I consider important.
Yes.
In phase 1, which also we have to see happen, which is the ability of Gazans displaced from North Gaza, unless I missed it, if you said it.
Yes, you're right.
To return from
the
kind of, from the, I don't even know what to call it, to return back to where they used to live.
Which is uninhabitable, as Mohammed pointed out. Mohammed, you tweeted today, just read the full ceasefire text. It's literally the same as the May 27th, 2004 one, word for word, with 6 non-substantial changes in the appendix. Netanyahu, Biden, and Blinken have a lot to answer for, wasting 8 months of buying time for genocide. I mean, it's literally the same deal. And Biden's taking credit for it today. He walked away saying, look at me, he's done a tweet saying, I've negotiated a ceasefire.
Yeah, precisely. It is literally word for word. I got the text in Arabic. I have a colleague who asked for it in English. I couldn't find an English version, so I looked up the May 27th. It was exactly, literally identical. I just sent him that instead. There were no changes except for 6 non-substantial new items that were added in an appendix, and all of them are merely just explanation or elaboration on what the ceasefire entails, aside from one issue on the Philadelphia corridor, where Israel compromised eventually and agreed to leave by day 50. So I've been in talk with a lot of mediators since last July. One of them was saying that the only way you can get a ceasefire done is Israel needs to be dragged kicking and screaming into a ceasefire. There's no other way around it.
So on that note, there's been a lot of reporting that the incoming Trump administration is what pushed this to happen. Safat Hanan, who's one of our subscribers, asked in the chat a question a lot of people are going to ask. Does Trump get credit for this ceasefire? 2 Arab diplomats told the Times of Israel that his envoy, Steve Witkoff, this real estate guy, apparently put more pressure on Netanyahu in one meeting than Biden did over the course of a year. That's the reporting from the Times of Israel. Where do you stand on this, Mohammed? Do you believe Trump gets credit for this deal?
Well, basically, Biden did a lot of damage. Mediators were begging for, even Israel's own negotiating team was begging Biden to name and shame Netanyahu for sabotaging a deal. They never did. To the contrary, Biden chose consciously to, according to a former senior Israeli security official, he said it to me in November. He said Biden is engaging in a shameless attempt of rewriting history and gaslighting to basically to absolve himself of the responsibility for refusing to pressure Netanyahu by instead blaming everything on Hamas and never blaming Netanyahu and claiming that Netanyahu accepted the deal falsely every single time. But on the other side, with Trump, what he did was basically exert the most minimal level of pressure. He just said, get a deal done before my inauguration. That was basically the request. Witkoff was just telling Netanyahu there should be a deal before January 20th. At the same time, I'm afraid that there's going to be a transactional element to this kind of deal. Trump is a businessman. Netanyahu knows how to trade with him. There's in Israeli media, there are already reports that Trump promised to allow Israel to violate the ceasefire, resume the war after phase 1, as well as giving them a gift bag. Literally, the verbatim quote is a gift bag, lifting all sanctions Israeli settlers, extremists, and Israeli shady companies, as well as major land theft in the West Bank.
So Khalid Shah asked the same question, Mohammed. Would the ceasefire being possible without Trump? I don't say that as a supporter or fan of Trump, he says. Noga, you've been tweeting some interesting stuff in the Israeli press. You tweeted that quote that Mohammed just mentioned about Trump and Dermer saying, Trump, Netanyahu, Dermer agreeing that if there's a ceasefire, Trump will, quote, support Israel retroactively if it decides to return to fighting and violate the ceasefire. But you also tweeted a line from Chaim Levinson, Israeli journalist, saying there would be no deal had the great and grand Donald Trump taken Netanyahu's hand, bent it behind his back, then bent it a little more, then pushed his head into the table, then whispered into his ear that in a moment he was about to kick his balls. A shame Biden didn't realize this earlier. Where do you stand on the role that Trump and Biden have played on this?
First of all, I didn't tweet the first thing you mentioned. I actually
Okay.
haven't seen that, but I did tweet Chaim Levinson. Where do I stand? I think there's a lot more subtlety involved in all of these questions.
Yes.
I think that Israelis, and in particular Israeli men, even very smart and fairly left-wing men like Chaim Levinson, have a bit of a tendency to idealize Donald Trump in his, manly stereotype. I don't particularly idealize him in his manly stereotype. I think he did have an important role to play here. And I think we're in an era of really hard-knuckle politics. And Netanyahu today is a man who, he used to like to say about Arabs in general, right? That they only understand force. He's become a guy who only understands force. And right now, he's a kind of, I don't absolve him of any responsibility for anything, but he is a kind of, malleable material that's being smushed between a number of powerful forces. I think nothing is more powerful against him than his own coalition. Yeah. For a number of reasons. This is a choice. I always lose patience when people describe him as a victim of this coalition. Netanyahu all along, yes, before this war and since this war daily, has had the choice of dumping the most extremist, criminal, yes, racist nationalists that he brought into his government and exchange them for the Israeli center. And he has refused. So this is absolutely a government of choice, his choice.
So I'm going to jump in, Noga, and ask you about specifically then what is this government's intentions? Because Haaretz journalist Zivi Barel says the conclusion that emerges from this is that the government does not intend to reach the second stage of the deal, and its very existence indicates malicious intent, i.e. they could have done it all in one go, not 3 stages. He says the aspiration to establish and entrench themselves in Gaza and the dream of settlement there have not disappeared. How cynical should we be about whether Israel's going to go through with the 3 stages?
I think the question is, how cynical are they more than us? I think we should be, like all journalists, skeptical and cautious. Yes. And I think this Israeli government is a very dangerous, very extremist, and extremely unstable government. There's a paradox in the existence of this particular Israeli government, which is it's extremely weak, it's extremely fragile, it's febrile, everybody in it hates everybody else. But they want to survive. And Netanyahu's most forceful argument, including for, Bezalel Smotrich is a guy who has been famous for saying a lot of awful stuff. But one non-awful thing he said before he became minister was he referred to Netanyahu rather famously as Shakran ben Shakran, a lying son of a liar. There's no love lost here. But what Netanyahu's managed to do with these fellows is convince them that they have no other choice, that if they topple this government, that's it. They're done with politics because he's the only guy who'll take them. And that, unfortunately, has the power of force. So the weaker this government is, in a way, the more it sticks together.
So if we're going to talk about whether the deal survives or not, Michael Connors, one of our subscribers, asks, why would Hamas have accepted this deal if Netanyahu has no intention of entering phase 2? We've talked about the pressure or not pressure on Israel. Obviously, the Qataris, the Egyptians, and others are putting pressure on Hamas. Why does Hamas go into it? Is it because they've got no other alternative, or because they have faith that this 3-phase deal will work?
Well, Hamas is opting for the maximum plausibility possible of the deal sticking. There's no other guarantee, basically. They got a lot of verbal promises from Trump's team, from the Qataris, the Egyptians, that the deal might stick. There's a high likelihood, but their focus is on another thing. There's a clause in that agreement that says that as long as negotiations on phase 2 continue, phase 1 should continue alongside with it indefinitely. So that's why you see a lot of effort to make phase 1 as livable as possible, increasing the number of trucks going into Gaza to 600 per day, 50 trucks with fuel, half of them to northern Gaza, allowing 1 million displaced Gazans to return to the north, reopening hospitals and bakeries, etc. So there is the insistence on making phase 1 as livable as possible, because that best case scenario, that might become the new status quo.
Just to circle back, Noga, to something you were saying a moment ago. So Where's it gone? I had a question. Diba Jaffrey asked, just to get to the black and white yes or no, is the Israeli cabinet, the Smotrich, the Ben Gavirs alongside Netanyahu, is it going to actually agree to this? Or will Netanyahu let his coalition fall apart on this deal?
I don't think Netanyahu will willingly allow his coalition to fall apart on this deal. The answer is yes, in terms of the vote tomorrow. I still think that he's going to be able to push that through, but stage 2, as President Biden described it in his press conference, I can't see this Netanyahu cabinet voting for that.
Mohammed, another subscriber of ours, asks, what is stopping Israel from just rearresting the Palestinian hostages that are released, just like they did after the first prisoner exchange back in 2023? A lot of these hostages or Palestinian detainees who are being released on the Palestinian side by Israel are people who were released in November 2023 and then just rearrested. What stops Israel from doing it again?
Yes, and you use the very proper terminology here, hostages. There are 3 categories of Palestinian prisoners. There's prisoners that are convicted in military courts. The conviction rate is 99.74%. For Israeli settlers in civil courts, when they attack Palestinians, the conviction rate is 1.8%. It's insane. But there's the other category of administrative detainees, Palestinians held without trial or charges. But there is the third category of hostages, literally thousands of Gazans and Palestinians in the West Bank that Israel have rounded up as bargaining chips, nothing more. They're held without any suspicion at all. That's why in the ceasefire...
including doctors.
Yep. In the ceasefire agreement, it says verbatim that Israel will release 1,000 Gazans that were taken since October 8th that played no part, zero part, in the October 7th attack. So why was Israel holding on to those 1,000 individuals only as a bargaining chip? Now, as you said, there's no guarantee that Israel will not rearrest them, although it stipulates that very explicitly in the agreement. It said that they will not be rearrested or charged or put on trial for something that they were released in a deal of. It says also that there are 47 Palestinians that were released all the way back in 2011 in the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap that Israel rearrested. They should be released immediately in phase 1. Basically, there's no guarantee, but otherwise there's insistence that it should not be the case.
Mohammed, you said the words no guarantee. Nicole Anderson says, as far as I can tell, there isn't any enforcement mechanism to this agreement. Lebanon has a ceasefire with Israel, but that ceasefire continues to be violated. There are no consequences.
Well, the only guarantee is basically a very ruthless one, but it's that the Israeli public will keep demanding the release of the rest of the hostages. That's why it was divided into multiple phases. And the soldiers, the people that served in the IDF, who are sort of the pride of the Israeli public, will be delayed to phase 2, with the hope that there would be insistence on Netanyahu, on the Israeli military, to say that those served in your army, you let them down, you disappointed them, you should exert a responsibility now and assume responsibility and fulfill the deal. That's basically the guarantee. Nothing else is there to enforce it. It says in the agreement that Qatar, the United States, and Egypt are sort of guaranteeing or vouching that Israel will see it all the way through, as well as Hamas. But that's just as much worth as Trump's other promises to the world.
So let's take Noga, I've got a question from Lila Mehta. One of our subscribers says, thank you for organizers. Great to hear from Noga and Mohammed. I would really like to know why Joe Biden couldn't have achieved this earlier. Why now? Why in the last week before Trump becomes president? No doubt both Biden and Trump will take credit for this. They are. Does the panel think that Trump has something to do with the ceasefire, which we discussed? So why now from the Biden perspective, Noga? You've been following this closely from the Israeli side, the American side. Joe Biden saying, look, it's, he got very annoyed at a reporter today who said, does Trump get credit for this? And he turned and said, are you joking? But Trump is taking credit. And a lot of people are saying, yeah, it's Trump and Witkoff who did this. It's your last week in office. Why now, Noga?
Listen, I'm not going to join the pylon on Joe Biden, who I think was handed really a bitch of a hand in this whole situation. And I have criticism of him like I have of many people, but I don't think the burden of the major responsibility for this catastrophe falls on him. I think that Biden and Blinken wanted very badly to get this done before leaving office. And I think here we saw an unusual confluence of purpose between the incoming Trump administration. Trump, for his own reasons, wants this off his desk before he comes in. He's made that clear for a while. I've noticed that it's one of the very few issues on which he has been consistent since winning saying that he doesn't want this war in his hands and he wants the hostages back. That's what he keeps repeating. He's not going to get the hostages back the way he has demanded before Inauguration Day. It looks like he's going to get 3. Yeah. I don't know if they'll be American Israelis, as President Biden implied. I think both deserve credit, and I think both are imperfect men. And I'm going to stick to my guns.
Fair enough. You stick to your guns. Let me bring Mohammed. I assume you disagree on your view of Joe Biden to Noga.
Basically, there's the good and the bad. The good, Biden quietly a couple of days ago, according to Israeli media, imposed restrictions on Israel's chip imports to Israeli high-tech companies. That was silently done. There were other measures.
No, very loud. In Israel, very loud.
Yeah, in Israel, but not outside of it.
Yeah, I didn't hear much about it in the US. That's true.
I just posted it in the chat, the link to that news in Hebrew. But he also imposed sanctions on Israeli settler organizations like Amanah that are vital to the Israeli settler enterprise and other extremists and settlers. He didn't do enough. He was far from doing enough. On the ceasefire itself, according to an Arab diplomat, a senior Arab diplomat that I spoke to recently in November, she said basically Biden is an ideologue. His support for Israel is ideological, purely ideological, as well as other political considerations. Whereas Trump is more of a businessman. She said that Biden's heart is in it, blind support for Israel, and that he considers any last-minute pressure or change of heart on policy on Israel to be, quote, a taint on his reputation. Which is very consistent with what I've got from other mediators or Arab officials. I'm not sure how much to put into that narrative in terms of Trump being sort of non-ideological, but at the same time, you see Blinken having a pathological, compulsive habit of non-stop saying that Hamas is the only obstacle to the ceasefire, Israel accepted, which Israel's own negotiating team insisted that destroyed the ceasefire negotiations completely. So I wouldn't give the Biden team any credit at this moment.
Michael Morgenthau asks, Mohammed, in a ceasefire, fire usually ceases. In this case, fire against Palestinians will continue. In the West, it'll be seen as a ceasefire. How about within Palestinian communities?
Well, basically, in the ceasefire, that was something that Hamas was insisting on, is that a ceasefire means actually ceasing fire. It does not just mean temporarily pausing, getting hostages out, and then back to war. The other thing is that there was a lot of fighting on the wording. Israel wanted to use the term suspending military operations or ending military operations, which opens the door for saying that this is not a military operation, it's a security operation to bomb this area where Hamas is trying to regroup or use any other loopholes of the sort, which is why there was a lot of fights on the very technical wording, word by word in the final agreement. On the other side, for people in Gaza, as immediate as this war stops, a whole nightmare awakens. There's a process of non-life that Gazans have been trapped into for the last 2 decades. You're not allowed to have a job, not allowed to have a life. You cannot move out of your parents' home, put food on the table, start a family, none of these things that make you basically a human with a purpose. There's also a lot of deaths that are going to occur out of untreated injuries and wounds or starvation, the cold, the weather. Like a lot of my friends and family in Gaza basically say that we miss having a wall behind our backs. There are no walls anymore. Everybody's stuck in flimsy tents in the freezing winter. So the deaths would continue. The other thing is that Israeli surveillance drones will never stop. There is a sound in Gaza that never stopped for the last 2 decades. Every time I talk to family or friends, that sound is always constantly in the background, and it goes like zzz, and it never stops, and it's in your head driving you nuts 24/7. These are Israeli Predator drones that are equipped to shoot to kill at any minute. Those would continue as well. So the trauma will persist. The only thing that will be different is, I think, mainstream media pretending that Gaza no longer exists and let's move on from this. Everything is perfect there.
So a lot of questions from subscribers, Noga, from Sabah Shokat and from Saqib Zahid. They're all asking, what's happening in the West Bank? Is this Trump rewarding Netanyahu with further settlement in the West Bank? How does a ceasefire in Gaza affect the West Bank?
A lot's happening in the West Bank. There's been a huge spike in settler violence. This started before the war, it's important to say. This is a government which has senior, very powerful ministers in it whose explicit aim is for Israel to annex, take over, and in some cases, ethnically cleanse the West Bank. So I want to just, this is as if you had a government with David Duke in it, more or less. This is an extremist
Well
government.
said.
And these particular ministers have power way beyond their actual, popularity among the population, because Netanyahu, who is on trial, needs them. And nobody else would sit with him as an indicted criminal. And he ended up choosing what was expedient for him. That said, there's something else that I think is interesting that's going on in the West Bank. And it's that the Palestinian Authority has chosen on a radically different path towards Trump version 2 than it chose towards Trump version 1. So I need just a minute to go into it a little bit. When Trump was elected in 2016, he was basically an unknown quantity.
Yes.
He had said a few things Palestinians didn't like during the elections. It wasn't a big issue, you may remember, in 2016. But then he actually spoke about the two-state solution in the presence of Netanyahu in a strange press conference. And so the whole thing was very confusing. But what happened is that the Palestinian Authority basically rejected everything having to do with Trump outright. The Trump administration rejected everything having to do with Palestinians. You may recall that they kicked out or removed the credentials of Hussam Zumlot, who was the Palestinian ambassador to Washington. There was basically a rupture of ties. This did not serve the Palestinians well. And the Palestinian Authority this time is choosing a completely different tack. And it's interesting because if you speak to Palestinian officials here, they're kind of optimistic about Trump this time, not just because he has this new Lebanese son-in-law and a kind of wider range of Middle East advisors, but they think that they have an in with him, that they've now figured him out. Yeah. Netanyahu, meanwhile, seems to be on a collision course with Trump. So I think we're in for a bumpy road and some surprises.
I think bumpy road is key. I've got a lot of people on social media telling me, oh, Mehdi, you should apologize to Trump. You got Trump wrong. He's bringing peace to the Middle East. I said, the guy's not even president yet. We got 4 years of Donald Trump. Maybe people in America have short memories. I have a very long memory. The thing about Trump is he's consistently inconsistent. And you mentioned the advisors. You're right about that. But he's also got Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel, who says there's no such thing as a Palestinian. He's got neocons like Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. So we'll see.
I think he thinks there's no such thing as a Jew as well. He thinks there's just Huckabee, a proto-Christian.
He wants Jesus to return and everyone ascends and all of that stuff. Douglas McMorris asks Noga, how is this being viewed inside of Israel today? Is there any outrage at the idea that the families of the hostages had little to no voice into Netanyahu's government, but Donald Trump has his ear and can push him into a ceasefire?
Of course there is. I mean, you know, the kind of radio that people here listen to while they're washing their dishes, the regular Israeli radio, all day long have had these hosts almost abashedly saying, why were 2 American presidents required to try and work to get our hostages back? Where the hell's our prime minister? It's a thread. It's been a thread for many, many months. It's been a thread from the start of the war, when Joe Biden appeared to be much more of a leader than Netanyahu did, who vanished at after the Hamas attack. So that's not news, but it's definitely being felt today.
Mohammed, very good question here, which if I can find it again, from Khalid Shah, who says, I read Blinken's statement saying Hamas has replaced almost all killed fighters in Gaza with new recruits. It seems he's already given a reason. Well, 2 questions here. One is he's saying it seems he's given a reason for Netanyahu to restart the war, or am I being too cynical? But also, I would add to Khalid's question, some of us said this in October and November of 2023. Every time you kill innocent Palestinians, you're only going to help Hamas recruit new members. And now we have the Secretary of State saying what we said 16 months ago, Mohammed.
Yeah, precisely. You've been saying it repeatedly, Mehdi, on basically every interview that I watched of you since October 7th. A lot of us were shouting it off rooftops, saying that at the end of this war, Gaza is going to be wiped out. Hamas is going to still be there in charge. So why do you burn Gaza off? Some people that I spoke to, including a recently retired senior American official who was an ambassador to the Middle East, their answer was basically that they are letting Israel get revenge, bloodlust, getting Israel just smash things to get it out of their system. That was basically it. They were saying to us that imagine if we in the US suffered a similar attack, we would want the people who did it to be burned out completely. So why not prevent Israel from doing that? In terms of Hamas's shape at the moment, they managed to retain the majority of their tunnel system. and reconstruct some of these. Even according to American estimates, it was about 65% of the tunnels still in place. They managed to recruit about 7,000 of their backup forces, what is known as ISNAD backup, people with rudimentary level of military knowledge. They know how to handle ambushes, explosive devices, rifles, etc., enough to maintain a long-term insurgency in Gaza to make the permanent stay of the IDF in Gaza a living nightmare for Israel. They also managed to recruit other people to join Hamas itself, way more than those 7,000. The estimates were about 12 to 13,000 people, and they will manage to recruit a lot more. Every home that lost a family member, every home that was destroyed completely, Israel created an incentive for a lot of people to bear arms and do something against Israel. So at the end of it, it was just a futile exercise of burning and destroying things purely for revenge and the spectacle of it, nothing more.
Noga, do you want to respond to that? But also, got a question from Jane Hayward, one of our subscribers, says, question for Noga. Why are you so generous to Biden? Surely the responsibility is largely with him. Why do you seem to think he couldn't have stopped this earlier? And it is a good question that a lot of people on the left are making today, which is Donald Trump vindicated those of us who said that Joe Biden could have picked up the phone and stopped this. I wrote a piece for The Guardian about a year ago, Noga, saying Ronald Reagan famously called Menachem Begin during the siege of Beirut and said, stop it, and he stopped it in 20 minutes. Biden could have called Netanyahu and said, stop it, in the way that apparently Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff have. Do you disagree with that?
I disagree in part. I think we should remember that until recently, the world here in the Middle East was quite different. Russia was strutting around. Syria was a major, not a major force in and of itself, but a major force in its usefulness to Iran to get massive weaponry into Hezbollah. Lebanon was in a different situation. Hezbollah had power that it no longer has. So it's easy to compare 6 months ago and today. I definitely hold Netanyahu responsible as the Prime Minister of Israel for not having signed on this deal, not 6 months ago. I think it could have been done 8 months ago. Yeah. That's not a question. But I think that Joe Biden, at the beginning of this process, Iran not only was threatening, but then acted towards Israel. Israel at that time had just suffered something that Netanyahu doesn't really let people talk about, right? He likes to compare October 7th to the Holocaust as if it were some kind of act of God, which absolves him of his responsibility.
His failures,
Yeah, and so let's put it as it really was. I think that what happened on October 7th was the worst, proportionately, the worst act of terror committed against a civilian population since we've come to use the term terror. We're talking, I can't remember, I did once the comparison with Americans, but it was something like as if, I don't remember, 57,000 Americans had died in a single day in a single sustained attack. What happened in Israel was massive. And the United States, that's had Israel at that time as the linchpin of it, and has for decades, of its entire Mideast strategy, had to cope with that. And, in addition, Biden and Netanyahu were not on friendly terms to begin with because of Netanyahu's attempted coup. This was also destabilizing for the states. So I don't know how kind I am to Biden, but I think that the situation is more complicated than this kind of punchy questions. Who gets credit? I think Trump does deserve some credit for sending his, capo from Florida, who did what Chaim Levinson said to Netanyahu. And I'm smiling, but I don't think it's the whole story.
Whereas Joe Biden sent Antony Blinken, who couldn't do that. Mohammed, you wanted to come back in there as Noga was speaking.
Sure. Yeah, on Netanyahu, fun fact about Netanyahu on October 7th and comparing it to the Holocaust, the person in Israel that was privately rejecting that comparison was Netanyahu himself. In a meeting with Israeli hostage families, he said, no, it was not a Holocaust. For it to be a Holocaust, they have to do that attack every single day and kill about 4,500 people daily. I will also add the link in the chat. So he became very combative about it when hostage families came to talk to him and blame him. But otherwise, he loves to use that card. I wanted to draw a silver lining about Hamas in Gaza because I know Netanyahu is going to use that Blinken argument to say we still need to go back in again. While I acknowledge that Hamas maintains the ability to sustain a long-term insurgency in Gaza, they do not have the capacity anymore to threaten Israel itself. the vast majority of their rockets have been depleted. They only have a very marginal minority of them that they would be extremely reluctant to use. Hamas leaders themselves say behind closed doors that if a ceasefire is there, they will not fire a single bullet on Israel for the next 10 to 20 years while Gaza is being reconstructed, and give a political process a chance. The other thing is that Israel's talking point is that if there is a ceasefire, it means another October 7th. And Israel's own respected analysts, security military analysts, all agree that the possibility of another October 7th is close to zero, if not an absolute zero, because October 7th, what made it unique was Israel being captured completely off guard. As Mark Reagan told you, we were caught with our pants down. That was his verbatim quote. So the likelihood of Israel driving drunk with their hands off the wheel again is close to zero.
Mohammed, you mentioned Hamas and you mentioned the next 10, 20 years. Just quick question. A lot of people asking this question is, I mean, phase two talks about, I'm just looking at the different phases. Phase 3 talks about reconstruction. We've heard a lot about political reconstruction. Is Hamas going to be in charge of Gaza in 2026?
It depends on Israel. Well, basically, Hamas does not want to stay in government anymore, and they've been very clear about it. They know that Gazans want a new government with the Palestinian leadership being unified in a technocratic independent government governing Gaza until elections are possible to be held, and then we determine who our next leaders would be. Behind closed doors, Hamas were telling Egypt, Qatar, Israel, the United States that we want to hand over government in Gaza to a technocratic committee linked to the Palestinian Authority, under the Palestinian Authority supervision, that would be in charge of providing services, but it would have to retain the civil servants in Gaza's government. All of them, every single one of them, was vetted and cleared by Israel itself. Remember when Netanyahu was allowing the Qatari cash infusions to go into Gaza to civil servants, he demanded fingerprinting every single recipient of that aid, including Hamas's civil servants, each single one of them, and he blacklisted only 300 out of 34 to 40,000 employees. So every single one of them was vetted and cleared. So Hamas says there should be a new entity that governs Gaza with those civil servants in place instead of just dumping them on the street and having absolute chaos.
A question to both of you from Sabah Shokat. I don't know if you guys, what you're hearing from your sources, but we're talking about a ceasefire deal. Sabah Shokat asks, do you think journalists will be allowed into Gaza now? Has anyone talked about whether Israel still keeps people out, Noga?
We're talking about it all the time and obsessively, and the Foreign Press Association that I'm part of has petitioned the Supreme Court repeatedly for access. I don't know. As far as I know, unfortunately, journalists are not mentioned in this agreement, at least in none of the versions that I have seen. And I don't hear even, like I was sort of expecting European governments who have major media outlets here, Germany, France, to be really up on the barricades about this issue. I have the feeling that only we care right now, and that we're all losing out because of it. I think one of the catastrophes of this whole war, almost for everybody, I would say, has been the denial of access to journalists.
In that front, I can add quickly, Israel is demanding that it maintains IDF presence in the Philadelphia corridor throughout the entirety of phase 1, throughout the 42 days, as well as surrounding the Rafah border crossing, which means the IDF might get a hand in saying who gets in Gaza and out of it. In the final agreement, it even specifies how many wounded Palestinians would be allowed out of Rafah on a daily basis, which means Israel gets control over who and how many, which is very concerning. One of the things that Biden was very concerned about, as well as Israel, when there was that pause for a week in November in 2023, was basically as soon as everything goes quiet, the world will get to see what's happening in Gaza, and it would be difficult to resume the fighting. I would imagine now it's 1,000-fold, that kind of sentiment.
And I just want to add something to what Noga just said about access to journalists and foreign journalists. Of course, we should always remember that something like 200 Palestinian journalists have been killed, if not more, since the start of this conflict, including today, I believe. There was a report I saw online of another Palestinian journalist killed who've been bravely trying to report in real time on a genocide that they are in the midst of. Let me ask you this, Mohammed. You mentioned earlier, you talked about the next decade or two while reconstruction's happening. Afzal Habib asks, what does reconstruction of Gaza need to look like now? What kind of support will be required to begin rebuilding the livelihoods of Palestinians in Gaza? And in a related question, I'll ask both of them to you, Mohammed. Jeannie Silver says, Israel wants UNRWA out of Gaza at the end of this month. Any possibility UNRWA can stay? If Israel pushes out UNRWA, which agency would take over its work?
In terms of UNRWA, that's a quicker one to answer. There's no other agency that can take over. It has about 13,000 staff in the Gaza Strip, well trained in the areas of education, health, food provision, etc. It's impossible for anyone else to fill the vacuum. There might be one loophole that allows them to stay in Gaza, is if the Rafah border crossing is opened with the first phase of the ceasefire under Palestinian control. In the deal, it says that it would be under Palestinian control with European Union monitoring there, and Israel will not be present at the border crossing. So there might be an opportunity for UNRWA to access Gaza in and out of the Egyptian part of Gaza's borders. On the other side, in terms of can you repeat the second question? Sorry, I lost track.
What does reconstruction look like? What needs to happen? You mentioned earlier, uninhabitable. How do you actually rebuild Gaza?
Yep. So UN estimates, it said that with Israel's restrictions in place, the ones that were there before October 7th, it would take 350 years to rebuild Gaza. It would take 17 years to just remove the rubble, clean the thousands of millions of tons of rubble that Israel created all throughout Gaza. A lot of areas in Gaza are no more. I saw satellite imagery all the way in July that the EU was collecting of Gaza meticulously. If you drop me in any neighborhood that I lived in or frequented, I wouldn't recognize which building was where. Nothing is standing anymore. But at the same time, in the ceasefire agreement, it specifies that Gaza should be reconstructed within 2 to 5 years. That is not far-fetched. It is possible. If Israel removes its draconian blockade on Gaza, there's a possibility there. Gazans themselves are more than happy to rebuild it. They can do it with remarkable speed if given the opportunity.
Noga wants to come in.
Yeah, I do want to say, I forgot, I've also lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, it's late in the day.
Well, we
About
appreciate
Gaza reconstruction. Yes, sorry. I do want to say one thing. The principal bodies that could fund and rebuild Gaza are the Gulf Emirates. And so far, they have made it completely 100% clear that they will only come and help the Gaza or lead the Gazan reconstruction if there's a clear path to Palestinian statehood and if there's Palestinian leadership. I don't see how Netanyahu's government gets there, and I'm very fearful that that's a stumbling block we may not be able to get over.
And on that note, Noga, Anas El-Qadi asks, what's next for Netanyahu?
Well, let me put it this way. His son has been in some kind of weird, publicly funded exile for most of the war, living in this hoity-toity place in Miami. Then his wife, you know, his beloved spouse, the rock of my existence, took off for Miami about 2 months ago. No one has seen her since. Again, this is being funded by the Israeli tax shekel. She didn't come back when her husband had to go into sudden major surgery. She didn't come back when her poor husband had to go into pre-scheduled testimony at his own trial. So I don't know, maybe some loneliness at the top. But Netanyahu is at a stage in which I genuinely believe that he will do anything within his power, and he has an enormous amount of power to stay in power.
Yeah.
He doesn't yet have absolute power, which is what he's aiming for. And I do want to say one other thing. Netanyahu is using this period of high tensions and of confusion for Israelis to basically enact his coup d'etat, the same one that was stopped by the Hamas attack of October 7th. Just today, on such a heavy day when one would think that convalescing from surgery, he would be fully focused just on trying to get this deal through. Turns out it's not the case. And this government advanced 3 laws, one of which is completely corrupt, that has to do with funding for rabbis, profoundly corrupt. And the other 2 are simply bullets shot at democratic institutions. So I think we have to keep in mind that what Netanyahu sees his own next step is turning into an autocrat. Whether the Israeli public lets him do it or not, we'll see.
Yes, and the Israeli public obviously needs to be cognizant, as you say, and not be distracted by what's going on everywhere else. Interestingly, and by the way, you said it's late. We appreciate you staying up late. We've gone way over time because we've had dozens of questions. We've got over 400 people in the chat, 500 last time I looked. We're going to wrap up now, but I do want to, this is a great question from, where has it gone? From Munim Ahad asks, Muhammad, is the ceasefire likely to weaken global activism towards a free Palestinian state? I fear that a lasting ceasefire will thrust the Gazan population back to a more devastating version of the pre-October 7th reality of apartheid. What do you make of that, Mohammed? You've seen, the silver lining of this horrific genocide in which Palestinians have died in record numbers. The silver lining has been that the world has come together. A lot of people, campus protests, activism. Is that going to die down as people think this is not a story anymore? This is not an issue anymore? Everything's resolved now.
Oh, well, basically, that's one of my main worries. But first, let me say I'm drinking coffee for the first time in months, so I can stay up all night. I'm happy to continue that space without you guys. But basically, one of my main concerns is that if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, there will be a very deliberate, conscious effort to push Gaza into extreme irrelevancy. We've seen that from certain regional actors, from Israel, from the United States, from mainstream media, from the European Union. A top European official that I met recently was saying that as soon as he got into office, all his advisors, his directors were saying, leave the Palestinian issue alone. Don't bother. You're going to burn a lot of political capital. You'll give yourself a headache. You're not going to get anywhere with it. Things are fine there. People are still alive. They're surviving. They're not getting killed. So move on. And he said he did. He moved on and didn't bother with the issue until October 7th happened. So that sentiment is going to happen again. We've been there a million times. I don't think I'm very old of age, at least. I like to flatter myself that way. But I've lived through 3 wars, 10 Israeli military operations, 2 ground invasions. That's how we measure our age in Gaza. And after each single one of them, as soon as there is a ceasefire, it's like Gaza never even existed.
Yes.
And that's one of my main concerns. At the same time, I would say that this time around, we have about 3 or 4 historic, unprecedented victories in terms of the Palestinian mobilization or using the momentum. One of them is Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza and having a broad spectrum, agreeing on that, of experts, human rights organizations. The other one is Israel being added to the United Nations blacklist of child murderers. The other one is the arrest warrants against Netanyahu. And there is an imminent one with there's the ICJ ruling about the illegality of the occupation. There's an imminent one with Israel being added to the list of countries or militaries that commit sexual violence in a systematic manner against Palestinian civilians and detainees. So those victories are in place that can mobilize. What I'm worried about is that as soon as the war stops, the people's attention will no longer be on what Israel is doing, because it's not spectacular anymore. It will be on what Palestinians want, what Palestinians are doing. And if we don't capitalize on this moment, we will lose it like any other opportunity before. If you look at South Africa, Namibia's occupation was deemed illegal in 71, I think. It took until 94 to dismantle apartheid, so that can be a similar thing, stuck for a couple of decades.
Yes, and I want one last question from Kareem Burris, which is, as journalists, how concerned are you that US-based media will use the ceasefire to push this story further and further to proverbial back pages? I'm very worried about it. I'm going to answer that myself and say I'm very worried about that. But you know what? Zeteo's not going to allow them to do that. Zeteo's going to stay focused on the Middle East, on Palestinian freedom, on what's going on between Israel, Gaza, the occupied West Bank and beyond. We're going to hold Donald Trump to account just as we held Joe Biden to account. And my camera's being a nightmare today. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to say thanks to Muhammad Shehada and Noga Tarnopolsky. Thank you to you all for joining us. I think there's something like, at some point, over 500 people of you were in this chat. We appreciate you all. Tell your friends to sign up to Zeteo. Support independent media. We're going to need it now more than ever before in 2025. Noga, Muhammad, appreciate you both. Thank you and good night.
Thanks so much for all the great work you're doing.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.